Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're opening up a stack of reports, analyses, really digging into artificial intelligence developments across Africa, specifically focusing on May 2025.
Yeah.
And May 2025, well, the sources paint it as a really pivotal month. It feels like the moment the conversation shifted, moving from just talking potential to concrete strategy and action. So our mission here is to unpack all that. What were the key policy shifts, the big investments announced? What innovation was bubbling up? And of course, the challenges that were still very much there. We want to understand what it all means for Africa and, importantly, for you following along.
Absolutely. And what's really striking in these sources is the picture of a continent not just watching from the sidelines, not anymore. In May 2025, Africa was actively engaging, shaping its own AI future, not just observing. It's a snapshot of ambition, yeah, but also facing some foundational realities.
Okay, let's dig into that. The sources start pretty high level. What was the big picture signal coming out of Africa on AI back then?
Well, the biggest signal, no question, was the African Union formally declaring AI a strategic priority. That happened at a high-level policy dialogue in Addis Ababa, May 17th, during eTechX 2025. And it wasn't just, a statement. The communique was detailed. It outlined commitments to essential digital infrastructure, quality data, compute power, skills, research, all specifically aimed at speeding up the AU's Agenda 2063.
Right, so embedding AI right into their long-term development plan, that's a serious top-down push. But were there tangible things happening alongside that, initiatives on the ground?
Oh, definitely. The sources show action backing up the strategy. So
Yeah.
May 12th, you had the UN Economic Commission for Africa, the ECA and Google announcing expanded training, specifically for young Africans and government officials.
Yeah.
And notably, these AI sprinters courses just for policymakers, really trying to get them up to speed quickly.
Okay.
And also around then, May 12th-ish, a big private sector partnership. Cassava Technologies linking up with Zindi.
Indeed, right, the data science network.
Yeah, exactly. Africa's largest. Right. They partnered to provide AI solutions and, crucially, GPU as a service across the continent using Cassava's infrastructure.
GPU as a service. Okay, so basically making that powerful and expensive computing needed for serious AI more accessible.
Precisely. High-performance compute is a huge bottleneck the sources keep mentioning. That partnership tackles it head-on. And speaking of funding these ambitions, that proposed $60 billion African AI fund. That was a major signal.
60 billion, wow.
Yeah, part of the African Declaration on AI. It's meant for long-term financing, research, startups, capacity building. You see this drive for homegrown solutions everywhere, like the Mfungi supercomputer project, aiming to train large language models in African languages. It's about digital sovereignty, a term Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed of Ethiopia highlighted.
That phrase, digitally sovereign Africa, it really does jump out from the reports, doesn't it? A desire for self-determination in the digital age. And Ethiopia itself, the sources put it right at the center of these discussions, especially with eTech's 2025.
Yes, Ethiopia definitely positioned itself. Hosting eTechs from May 16th to 18th wasn't just a local tech show. It drew over 15,000 people, 55 countries. Big focus on AI, cybersecurity, fintech. They signed, I think, 20 meadows, signaling real progress. Prime Minister Abiy used it to showcase their own national efforts, the Ethiopian Artificial Intelligence Institute, EAII, their digital ID program, the 5 Million Coders campaign, a very clear government-led push to build those foundations.
Okay, so we've got the continental strategy, national governments pushing hard, building capacity. What about the private sector, the startups? Where is the money actually flowing and what breakthroughs were happening on the ground in May 25?
Well, a really landmark investment came on May 29th from Safaricom, huge East African telco. They committed $500 million over 3 years, specifically for AI infrastructure across their network and the wider East African region.
$500 million, that's significant.
It is a major regional player making a strategic pivot. But, it also highlights the scale of the challenge. The reports mention Africa having only about 1% of global AI compute capacity. So 500 million is huge, yes, but also shows just how much investment is needed continent-wide.
Right, connects straight back to that infrastructure gap. So big players stepping up. What about support for the smaller guys, the startups?
Google's 2025 AI Accelerator for African Startups applications closed May 9th. That offered up to $350,000 in Google Cloud credits, plus mentorship, access, crucial stuff beyond just cash. These accelerators are vital for nurturing that early ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
And there were more targeted deals, too, like Wingu Africa and Ethiopia's EAII, investing $2 million specifically into Ethiopian AI startups, giving them infrastructure access, cloud, compute, plus mentorship and exposure.
So really trying to tackle those startup hurdles directly. Okay, what kind of actual applications were starting to emerge then? What problems was AI solving, according to the sources?
McKinsey had a report out in May 25, estimating generative AI alone could unlock up to $100 billion annually for African economies.
Wow, $1 billion.
Sounds huge and a bit abstract, right?
Yeah.
But the sources quickly give concrete examples, like AI translation for local languages. Amharic was mentioned specifically. And this isn't just a nice-to-have feature. For AI to really work in healthcare, education, agriculture across Africa, it has to understand and speak the local languages. The sources suggest this is fundamental for adoption.
Makes sense. Real inclusion.
Exactly, and practically. Agriculture saw some really interesting uses highlighted. Esther Kamani's company, Farmer Lifeline Technologies.
Yeah, you mentioned her.
Right. Operational in 5 countries, using AI cameras and basic SMS alerts to help smallholders spot pests and diseases early, and designed to be accessible, even reaching women in rural areas with just basic phones. That's powerful. Also a chatbot in Kenya, the virtual agronomist, using satellite data for fertilizer recommendations. Real-world tools making a difference.
AI on the farm. Huge potential there for food security. Any other sectors mentioned?
Yeah, public services. Rwanda's justice system introduced an AI legal platform from a local firm, IST Legal, aimed at simplifying processes, managing cases better, and crucially, with multilingual support. So AI moving into government functions for efficiency.
Fascinating. All this momentum, policy, investment, innovation. But naturally, the question becomes, how do you govern this? What were the sources saying about AI policy and regulation discussions across Africa in May?
Yeah, that was a major focus. The theme was finding that balance, right?
Yeah.
Fostering innovation while tackling ethics, data protection, safety. The AU, following its declaration, kept pushing its continental AI strategy. And that strategy consistently emphasizes homegrown solutions and responsible regulations tailored for Africa, highlighting the need for good quality local data and strong privacy safeguards.
So a continental approach. Were individual countries also making moves?
Oh yes, several were active. Lagos State in Nigeria, a major hub, obviously announced it would release the country's first AI guidelines soon. And what's interesting is the language. Guidelines, not strict laws initially. Suggests a flexible framework, guide development, learn as you go, maybe avoid locking things down too early.
Pragmatic.
Seems like it. Then Kenya's National AI Strategy for 2025-2030 launched in April, but very relevant in May discussions, really champions ethical, inclusive AI. Big focus on data governance, cybersecurity, especially for healthcare and agriculture.
Guidelines versus a full strategy, different approaches. What about places like South Africa?
South Africa already had a draft national AI plan, and their existing laws, particularly POPI, the Protection of Personal Information Act, heavily influence AI deployment there. Interestingly, the sources noted the South African Revenue Service, SARS, was already using AI for tax collection, so practical implementation within government. And Rwanda, alongside its legal platform, had UNESCO and GIZ training judicial operators on AI, data protection, rule of law, showing a proactive focus on building capacity within the legal system itself to handle AI.
So a real mix, strategic plans, flexible guidance, practical capacity building. What were the big themes cutting across all these policy talks, according to the sources?
Data privacy, cybersecurity, ethics, and cross-border collaboration kept coming up consistently. Programs like those ECA Google AI Sprinters specifically train policymakers on these very topics. And a Brookings article from May 7th really hammered home the need for Africa to build sovereign capacity in AI safety and security. Mentioned the new Africa AI Council's role in that.
That sovereign capacity idea, again, seems central. Wanting control, self-reliance in how AI is built and used.
Exactly. Building a local expertise, local data, local rules for local realities, not just importing everything. And the sources picked up on an interesting pattern, the traction for a regulatory sandbox approach. Lagos's guidelines, reports of Uganda's regulator pledging sandbox licenses for startups, it suggests a preference for, maybe, lighter touch regulation at first. Let regulators learn alongside the innovators, avoid rigid rules that might stifle things too early, a bit different from some other global approaches.
Makes sense. Now, behind all these trends and policies are the people, the organizations driving it. Who were some of the key figures the sources highlighted from May 2025?
Yeah, the sources definitely put faces to the movement. People like Esther Kamani, who we talked about with Farmer Lifeline, using AI to help smallholders, reaching rural women. Just a great example of inclusive innovation. Then there's Jayshree Naidu from Envision It Deep AI in South Africa, developing AI radiology tools that are actually being used in the UK, shows African AI competing globally. And Rose Nakasi, leading the Maker AI Health Lab in Uganda. Her focus, the sources emphasized, is co-designing AI tools with doctors, with ministries, for local health issues like malaria, cervical cancer, making sure it's practical and relevant.
Real-world impact, designed locally but meeting global standards. Who else stood out?
Dr. Teddy Nalabega's comments from the Paris AI Action Summit seemed to resonate. Her call for Africa to define its own AI future, include local languages and values, position itself as a co-architect of global AI rules, a strong voice for strategic engagement. Dr. Worku Gashena, head of Ethiopia's EAII, was prominent too, pushing Ethiopia's vision as an R&D hub and overseeing partnerships like the one with Wingu Africa. And policymakers were visible. Namibia's ICT minister, Emma Theophilus, Egypt's Dr. Hoda Baraka. They were slated to speak at the Africa Internet Governance Forum about harnessing AI. Shows leadership buy-in.
Leaders setting the vision, shaping policy. What about the organizations making it happen on the ground, enabling all this?
Well, beyond government bodies like EAII, you absolutely have to mention Zindi, building that grassroots talent pool, that community of data scientists. Their partnership with Cassava for GPUAS is a perfect example of enabling others. Cassava Technologies itself is key. Their AI factory plans in South Africa, their infrastructure partnerships. They're building the physical backbone. And of course, Safaricom. That huge investment is going to enable a whole ecosystem in East Africa. These are the players providing the platforms, the resources, the pipelines.
It definitely paints a picture of incredible momentum, real ambition in those May 2025 reports. But they didn't shy away from the challenges either. What were the big hurdles Africa needed to clear?
No, they were very clear. And infrastructure is just persistent. Infrastructure deficits, unreliable power, lack of high-performance computing outside a few hubs, limited regional cloud options, high hardware costs, often due to import duties. McKinsey, GSMA report specifically called it out, Africa having only about 1% of global AI compute capacity. That just says so much.
It really does. The basic building blocks are still a major issue in many places. What else?
Data ecosystem maturity, that's critical. Availability, quality, access, governance, all issues. There's a lack of local, high-quality, accessible data, especially in indigenous languages. And the sources stress this isn't just an inconvenience. It leads to biased AI if you only train on outside data, or it just stops you developing solutions that actually fit the African context.
Right. If the AI doesn't understand local nuances, local languages, local problems, it's not going to be effective or fair. What about people?
The talent gap. Huge issue. A SAP report from May 25 said, 60% of African companies see AI skills as extremely important, but pretty much all expected big gaps. And it's already having an impact. Project delays, failed innovations, initiatives like ECA Google, Ethiopia's 5M coders are trying to tackle it, but scaling them up and keeping that talent from leaving, that's tough. Brain drain is real. And finally, sustainable funding. Investment is growing, yes, but heavily concentrated. 4 countries, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, got something like 83% of AI startup funding in Q1 2025. Africa's overall share of global VC is tiny. And relying too much on donor funding isn't sustainable long-term.
Those are significant hurdles, definitely interwoven. But did the sources point to any unique advantages Africa might have? Things that could help navigate these challenges?
Oh, absolutely. Key catalysts were mentioned. Africa's youthful population is a massive asset, adaptable, increasingly tech-savvy, potentially a huge engine for innovation if given the right tools and chances. Then there's the leapfrogging potential. Africa's done it before, like with mobile payments bypassing traditional banks. Experts suggest Africa can adapt existing AI models, customize them, rather than having to build everything from absolute scratch. That could speed things up.
Right, adapt and apply.
And crucially, that strong drive for homegrown solutions and digital sovereignty we keep mentioning. It's about building AI that's contextually relevant, solves local problems, fosters African ownership. That reduces dependency and ensures the tech serves African priorities.
So not just using AI, but building AI for Africa by Africans. That feels like a core theme. So what's the big takeaway, the imperative moving forward based on these sources?
Collaboration. That came through loud and clear. Public-private, intra-African, international partnerships, all vital. Ethical governance, building trust through data protection, fairness, transparency, non-negotiable, and inclusive development, making sure AI benefits everyone doesn't just widen the gaps that already exist.
Collaboration, ethics, inclusion, rooted in homegrown solutions. It really sounds like the focus isn't if AI will be big in Africa, but how it will be built and governed there, with African ownership front and center. Okay, let's zoom out for a second. To wrap up the picture from May 2025, how did all this activity in Africa fit into the wider global AI scene back then? What else was going on?
Well, globally, the pace was just relentless, right? Alibaba unveiled its Qwen 3 model, Apple rolled out new AI features, Google's AME system showed amazing diagnostic potential in medicine, AI adoption was picking up speed in manufacturing, energy, and even everyday things like Google search were changing fast. AI overviews were appearing for, 14% of keywords by May. A noticeable jump, showing how quickly it was hitting the mainstream.
The tech just keeps accelerating everywhere. What about regulation globally? How are the major players handling it?
Very actively, and sometimes contentiously. The UK saw big debates in the House of Lords about forcing AI developers to disclose copyrighted training data.
Mm-hmm.
The music industry was particularly concerned.
Mm.
In the U.S., the House passed a bill aiming for a 10-year pause on state and local AI laws. The idea was to avoid a confusing patchwork of rules and boost federal competitiveness with a unified approach. And other places like Saudi Arabia, South Korea, Singapore, the UAE, all actively developing their own governance frameworks, strategies, ethical guidelines. Everyone was scrambling to figure it out.
So, a global scramble for regulation. How did Africa's approach, as seen in these May reports, compare?
It's interesting. While some big powers were diving into specifics like copyright or focusing on centralizing control domestically, Africa, through the AU and national efforts, seem to be pushing for harmonized continental strategies and data governance frameworks quite early on. It suggests a deliberate effort to build a unified regional stance from the start, which could give the continent a stronger collective voice globally, and maybe allow for AI development that's better tailored to African needs, aligning with that whole digital sovereignty push.
This deep dive really drives home that May 2025 wasn't just business as usual. It was Africa clearly stating its intent not just to join the AI revolution, but to actively shape it on its own terms. We saw major policy moves from the AU, big investments like Safaricom's $500 million, real innovation starting to solve problems in health and agriculture, and the profiles of people and organizations pushing it all forward.
That's right. And while those challenges, infrastructure, data, talent, funding, are absolutely real and significant, the momentum documented in these reports is undeniable. Fueled by those unique advantages, the youth dividend, the potential to leapfrog, and that really powerful drive for homegrown, relevant AI.
The sources clearly map out the ambition, but also the steep climb ahead. May 2025 definitely feels like a moment where aspirations started turning into concrete action across the continent.
Indeed. And maybe, thinking about those huge ambitions versus the very real hurdles laid out in the sources, perhaps the most critical question isn't just about the tech itself, it's whether those strategies, those investments, can actually be implemented effectively right across the continent. Can they translate into progress that's truly inclusive and sustainable, benefiting everyone, not just creating a few isolated hubs? That's the big question, the challenge these reports really leave you pondering.
A powerful thought to consider as we track Africa's journey in the age of AI. Thanks for joining us for the deep dive.